The handouts that are being passed out, if there aren't enough of the paper, can be found on the shared Google Drive. And the manuscript that you will have before you is much, unfortunately, like many of our, or all of our New Testament manuscripts, with a number of scribal errors, if you will, due to errors of the eye and other similar mistakes. However, the manuscript that I have has been corrected toward the scribe's original intent. So, the anonymous Catena to Jude. Over a century ago, Karl Staub lamented that the systematic study of Catena commentaries had reached a standstill following what he called a spring of renewed interest in the Catena. The Catena summer, for which Staub hoped never having materialized in the 20th century, seems finally to be upon us, due in considerable measure to the labors of the Catena project at the University of Birmingham under the direction of Hugh Houghton and others. However, most of the summer sunlight has been shed abroad in the Catena of the Gospels, particularly Matthew and Luke, Acts and Paul. The same cannot be said for the Catholic epistles. In his study of the Catena of the Catholic epistles, Karl Staub concluded that the 7 manuscripts he studied, the entire Catena of the Catholic epistles had been transmitted in 4 of them. For Jude, he added 2 additional manuscripts. What Staub considered to be the Catena to the Catholic epistles in Jude is known as the Catena Andreae. These manuscripts are cataloged by the Clavis Patrum Graecorum as C-176. In his study, Staub also assessed the Catena in 2 other important witnesses, Vatican manuscripts 652 and 1270, which are GAs 1842 and 621 respectively, which contain anonymous scholia. He asserted that these 2 witnesses contained a commentary text that formed the basis of the whole Catena of the Catholic epistles. Staub argued that these 2 manuscripts had essentially preserved the Catena, GA 1842 being the more faithful representation of the same. Since the publication of Staub's study, these claims have gone largely untested. In this paper, I will attempt to show that while I believe that the witnesses belonging to the C-175 Catena type, the anonymous type, are indeed, as Staub suggests, the foundation of the Catena of the Catholic epistles, contrary to Staub, Vatican manuscript 652, that's 1842, GA, and 1270, or GA 621, do not essentially preserve the Catena, but are rather an abridgment of it. It will be further shown that the anonymous type is comprised of both a longer and an abridged tradition, the latter which likely developed early and in parallel to the longer, and that GA 1842 is not necessarily its most faithful representative. And lastly, I'll conclude with some final observations about how these 2 traditions together form the basis of the later Andreas Catena. I will use the Epistle of Jude to test these hypotheses. To conduct this research, I made 2 collations of the Epistle of Jude. The first is a complete collation of all extant continuous text witnesses to the epistle based on transcriptions provided by Tommy Wasserman. The second is a collation of all these witnesses, all the witnesses included in the ECM plus witnesses to C-175 anonymous type. The Catena text for all C-175 witnesses was transcribed and collated in full, including the Catena of 6 C-176 Andreas witnesses for comparison. However, these were not included in the collation of the Catena. Individual scholia were numbered based on the verse on which they were commenting. I also used the tools available in the CBGM to assess the data, including pre-genealogical coherence of witnesses, which is their average agreement at all places of variation, textual flow diagrams, and a global stemma of witnesses for the biblical text, which represents an editorial hypothesis about the relationship of witnesses based on the priority and posteriority of variant readings at all places of variation. Staub counted around 240 unattributed scholia for the Catholic epistles compared to 189 attributed ones. For Jude, nearly 5/6 of all scholia are unattributed in all Catena types compared to 1/3 in James. However, the Catena in C175 is not merely unattributed but anonymous. The CPG has denominated it as Commentarius Primigenius in keeping with Stab's assessment that these witnesses contain the original commentary, the Catena, the Catholic epistles, of which the Andreas Catena is a later development. From the global stemma, which you can see behind you, which includes the ECM witnesses plus C175 manuscripts, we can make a few initial observations. You can also find this in your figures and tables handout. A solid cluster of C175 witnesses can be readily identified, cluster 103. At the head of this cluster, we find GA424, whose closest potential stematic ancestor is 319, one of the 7 solidly Byzantine witnesses in the ECM. Other group members, not readily apparent in this stemma, but clear from both pre-genealogical coherence and from shared readings, are, for example, GA018, a witness to the Andreas Catena, and GAs 1360, 1862, and 1888. This cluster's average group pre-genealogical coherence is 96.8%. Within cluster 103, there are 2 subgroups. Subgroup 1, GAs 103, 606, and 641, with an average agreement of 99.3%, and subgroup 2, consisting of 1360, 1862, and 1888, with an average agreement of 98.2%. There is also another identifiable cluster whose head is GA 605. The rest of the C175 witnesses are textually distinctive, both from the rest of the manuscripts of the anonymous type as well as from each other. These witnesses have a relatively low agreement in their biblical text of 86.9% and agree with the rest of the anonymous type witnesses at 89.2%. Stab's representatives of the Catena of the Catholic Epistles, 621 and 1842, belong to this class. Lastly, there's also a distinct cluster of C176 witnesses with GA 307 as the head of the group. This global stemma is based on an analysis of the biblical text of these witnesses. A nearly identical picture emerges when we compare them in their Catena text. The aerial view of these witnesses is represented by the heat map on pages 7 to 8 of Figures and Tables handout. The heat map compares all of the anonymous type witnesses based on the content of their scholia. It is admittedly a crude comparison, but it's helpful for that very reason in many respects. We see that the anonymous type in Jude is anything but homogeneous. There are, in fact, 2 textual streams, a longer and a shorter stream. In the longer stream, GA 327 is an outlier. It's distinct from the rest of the group in that it omits entire scholia and truncates others. And GA 1780, there at the top of the heat map, also omits everything after verse 4, and so because of this, it was eliminated from statistical analyses and treated as a highly fragmentary witness in the Catena text. However, the other witnesses of the longer stream, as I'll call it, are related in their Catena text in much the same way as they are in their biblical text. For example, the rest of the longer stream witnesses belong to cluster 103 or cluster 105, except, of course, for GA 327, which was, as we've already said, is an outlier in both biblical and Catena texts. Lastly, subgroup 1 with 103, 606, and 641 is also a distinct subgroup in the Catena. These follow a similar pattern in omitting scholia units, 8 alpha 9, 12 gamma 11, and 22 alpha 3, and in placing scholium 9b at the very end of the Catena, to Jude. And they're the only manuscripts to do this, and it's clearly a scribal error relating, though it does relate all of these 3 manuscripts or witnesses genealogically. The average agreement among witnesses of the longer stream in the Catena is 82%, and while this may seem very low, keep in mind that the average pre-genealogical coherence of all witnesses of the anonymous type is only 69.7%. So the shorter stream comprises the same exact witnesses which also have a unique biblical text, namely 463, 608, 621, 1162, 1842, 1871, and 2242. The average agreement among these witnesses in the Catena is 81.43%, internally very similar to the longer stream witnesses. Yet, when we compare the longer stream and shorter stream only where they're both extant, their agreement is very low at 55.6%. Also, more on that in a moment. Also notice that the shorter stream contains no scholia that aren't already also included in the longer stream, except in the case of GAs 1842, 621, and 463, which include this scholium 1 alpha 1, which comments on the identity of the epistle's author. GA 424 contains, I'm going to summarize these two paragraphs and say that GA 424 and 605 both contain two scholia that aren't included in any of the other anonymous type manuscripts. And in fact, these two scholia are attributed, but not in 424 or 605, but rather in the Andreas Catena. And you can see here 424 that these two scholia, which I called 6 alpha 1 and 6 beta 1, are actually included in the margin of 424, probably by the same scribe, but they're clearly marginal. And in both of these texts, they seem to be the result of contamination from the Andreas Catena. Summary. More work has to be done on these witnesses and other Catena types in the Catholic epistles. Of course, that is necessary. Still, these preliminary results suggest that the nature of the biblical text first correlates to that of its Catena text. Manuscripts related in Jude are also related in their Catena. This is at least the case for C175 in Jude. We have also shown that the anonymous type is not homogeneous, but represents two different but related textual streams. The exact way that they're related will be discussed in the rest of this paper. We move on. While Staub argued that GA 621 and 1842 essentially preserve the Catena, I contend that these witnesses belong to a textual stream, that is the shorter stream, representing a recension of the Catena, with the longer stream witnesses, which the longer stream witnesses essentially transmit. Staub observes that both GA 621 and 1842 are related to each other in the Catholic epistles, but that textual variants are significant in both, and each contains omissions due to homoteluton, but at different places. Since he claims 1842 as a more complete text, he based his discussion of the Catena on it and not on 621. This decision is questionable for three reasons. To begin with, and I should not have skipped these. So to begin with, the last folio of the manuscript, folio 105, which contains scholia 8 alpha 9 to 23 alpha 1, has been replaced with what looks to be paper and written with a 16th century hand. 1842 is a 13th century manuscript. And in addition to this, there are numerous lacunae on folio 105 verso, where the scribe left blank spaces between words and lines, omitting text that was probably illegible in his exemplar, perhaps the original damaged folio of 1842. One way or another, the manuscript is less reliable in Jude, at least. Furthermore, the marginal inclusion of scholium 1 alpha 1 also suggests that the possibility that 1842 was copied either from an exemplar that omitted this scholium or from one that also had it in the margin. In contrast, GAs 621 and 463, the only other two manuscripts to attest this scholium, attest it clearly. Lastly, the text of 621 and also, interestingly, 1162 is unique because it is sometimes shown to abridge the shorter stream itself. The abridgment is significant because it often aligns with the Andreas Catena. in the text of GA 307, the witness that occupies an important position in the stemma of the C176 type. Take, for example, Scholia units alpha A 1 to 2. Notice how 621 abridges the text from 1842 in red, and how 307 also reads hupneo instead of hupno with 621 and not with 1842. Likewise, both 621 and 307 abridge the text of 8 alpha 2. Further evidence of abridgment in the shorter stream of the longer stream can also be demonstrated in the omission of Scholia 8 alpha 3 to 4, part of 8 alpha 5, 8 alpha 6 to 8, part of 8 alpha 9, and 8 alpha 10. And this can all be seen in the figures and tables handout. And also, curiously, in the addition of an 8 alpha 11. So after omitting all of those Scholia units within the commentary on verse 8, it adds this additional text of 8 alpha 11, which summarizes the theological content of the omitted Scholia units by attributing the heresies described in them to Mani and Arius. Furthermore, we note a curious feature in Scholia units 9 alpha 1 to 3, which read almost as a digest of the longer stream. The secondary nature of this reading can be inferred from the different ways in which manuscripts of the shorter stream render it. The reading of GA 621 is hard to understand as it stands by itself. The question that the text leaves the reader is, what does God permit and will? So in 621, he permitted and willed it to those who at that time were inclined to be less spiritual and had little regard for the unseen. GAs 1842 and 608, also 1871, supply meaning for this. If 621 if we're allowed to accept that 621 represents an older abridgment of the shorter tradition, or the shorter stream tradition, in that case, it isn't hard to see how the readings of 1842 and 608 arose with the addition of kaita adelan deiksai in the case of 1842, or deiksai diatu phenomenu in the case of 608 and 1871. In other words, he willed to reveal the unseen and the unknown, or God permitted it and willed to reveal the unseen through what was made manifest. GA 621 is clearly abridged, has clearly abridged the text so that other scribes felt the need to supply the meaning. These findings are actually consistent with Jacobo Marcon's observations on the Pseudo-Ecumenian Catena and Romans, in which he identified an abbreviated version. For example, he argued that GA 621 represents an abbreviated version of the normal typus stage. Furthermore, 6 of the 8 manuscripts he identifies as having transmitted the abbreviated text are also witnesses to the anonymous type in Jude. Interestingly, though, none of these 6 witnesses are members of the shorter stream, but rather members of the longer stream. So that while these witnesses have abbreviated Scholia in Romans, they don't in Jude. Nevertheless, the witnesses that we have identified as the shorter stream, or the abbreviated tradition, display the same characteristics as those identified by Marcon in the Pseudo-Ecumenian Catena to Romans, namely, the omission of whole comments or Scholia units, the shortening of neighboring texts, the reordering of words, adjusting of the syntax, for example, replacing finite verbs with participles, and the addition of links to connect different Scholia into single comments. Summary. As represented by GA 621 and 1842, shorter stream witnesses display the hallmarks of abridgment. The longer stream attests a coherent text, whereas the shorter stream is often less so or not at all, and where this is the case, the text of the longer stream clarifies the meaning of the shorter. Lastly, GA 621 and 1162 give evidence of earlier abridgment of which other shorter stream witnesses are an expansion toward the longer stream. Finally, 2 parallel streams. The longer and the abridged traditions were likely transmitted as parallel streams of the anonymous type, the former being the source of the latter. We can see this in 2 ways. First, we see editing toward the text of GA 621 in other witnesses of the shorter stream. For example, most witnesses of the shorter stream, as found in the text of 463, have the following reading in Scholia Unit 8.2, which is 8 Alpha 2, which is a composite of the text of 621 and the longer stream, as found in witnesses like 424. So Scholia Unit A Alpha 2 in GA 424 reads thus: the first part is the longer stream, and the second part after a hutos, or thus, is found in 621. How are we to know that the reading found in GA 463 is a composite, editing toward the text of 621? Well, evidence for this can be found in the Andreas type, taking the text of GA 307 as a representative. As far as I can tell, in Jude, at least, 307 never reads with witnesses of the shorter stream against 621, but will read with 621 against all or mostly all other witnesses of the shorter stream. An excellent example of this is Scholia Unit 22 Alpha 2, 42 to 48, where 307 agrees with the reading in 621, ton phaban aut ton apoballantis, against all other witnesses reading ton phaban aut tois hupaballantis. It's only 463 also reads apoballantis with 621. The difference between casting off their fear and subjecting them to fear, or instilling fear in them, regarding, in the context, the fire that is to come upon them, is rather stark. Casting off seems to be the harder reading here in context, and may suggest that 621 preserves an older, more original reading. However, 463 still retains the dative aut tois, which makes the understanding of its text more challenging. The point is that the Andreas Catena, represented by GA 307, consistently adopts readings found in the unique abridged text of GA 621 against the rest of the shorter stream. Second, the Andreas type incorporates both the longer stream and the shorter stream, treating them, it would seem, as independent sources. The heat map shows where manuscripts of the Andreas Catena overlap with longer stream and shorter stream, but it doesn't show how the Andreas Catena will include a scholium from the shorter stream in one place and the same scholium from the longer stream in another. Rarely are these scholia juxtaposed. For example, 307 includes commentary on Jude 9, not found in either of the shorter or longer stream, followed by scholium 9a from the shorter stream. This is followed by commentary on Jude 8, after which the Andreas Catenist reprises commentary on Jude 9, taken from scholia found in the longer stream. This is a common feature of the Andreas Catena to Jude. It regularly inverts the sequence of the scholia in the anonymous type or relocates them. What this shows us is that the Catenist who created the Andreas recension used the longer stream and the shorter stream of the anonymous type as two independent textual streams, adding material to them with and without attribution in such a way as to create his or her own unique form of commentary on the text. Summary and conclusions. The anonymous Catena in Jude is found in two forms, a longer stream and a shorter one. These two traditions always follow the same order and pattern of readings, except in subgroup 1, where scholium 9 beta is found at the end of the epistle, an error which scribes noted with marginal sigma. The shorter stream includes no additional scholia not found in the longer, except for subgroup comprised of 463, 621, and 1842, which includes scholium 1 alpha 1. Also, the tools in the CBGM have proven helpful in analyzing the witnesses used for this study. Both textual flow diagrams and a global stemma based on the biblical text helped identify witness clusters and relationships of these witnesses to the broader tradition. This analysis showed the relationship of witnesses based on their biblical text is positively correlative to the relationship they share based on their Catena text, suggesting that in general they were transmitted together. The shorter stream bears the marks of abridgment. It is more of a digest of the longer stream than a commentary in its own right. GA 621 has a unique but older text, sometimes preserving what appear to be original readings against the rest of the tradition. Finally, there remain many lacunae. The results of this study are only preliminary observations, and they can only be reliably made of the Catena to Jude, which admittedly is but a limited sample of the whole tradition in the Catholic epistles. These manuscripts deserve further study, not merely for the value of the manuscript tradition, but also for the inestimable worth of the exegetical tradition which these scholia have preserved for us. The conclusions drawn here need to be tested outside of Jude and to be more fully confirmed and established. If they were to be, I would suggest that C-175 should be reclassified as C-175.1 and C-175.2 in the CPG to reflect both longer and shorter stream realities. In his day, Stab opined that it was no great wonder why the tradition of exegesis on the Catholic epistles had received so little attention. As he says, the reason here was not any doubt about the canonicity of the letters, but the fact that they stand in immediate importance behind many other biblical books and in the same literary genre, behind the great epistles of the apostles to the Gentiles. In the old exegesis, the Catholic epistles had the same fate as many a quiet little flower that blooms hidden in the grass, while roses and lilies are admired by all. Well, one can only hope that the Catena summer's lease will not have all too short a date, and that the eye of heaven will cast his gaze upon the Catholic epistles as it has on other genres of the New Testament. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for concluding our session so worthily. Any questions, comments, remarks? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Maybe you mentioned this, but maybe I didn't get it. When you talk about average agreement between the witnesses, does this include iticism and orthographic variance?
No, I excluded iticisms, all orthographica rather, and the only ones I did keep were proper names. So mosetos, I kept certain proper names that appear to actually relate witnesses genealogically, but other than that, movable news were not counted. They are in the apparatus. So in the online apparatus, which is available through the forms and tables handout, they are there for completeness, but they were not counted in agreements.
Thank you very much for such a compelling paper. I'll need to spend a little time on the graphs, but I've got a transatlantic plane. You argued compellingly that the shorter stream is an abridgment of the longer stream. Do you have any ideas or hypotheses why someone would want to abridge it? Often we see traditions being enlarged. Is it a space-saving device? Are they consistently cutting out similar types of material, or are they just boiling it down to the pithiest of statements?
It's so interestingly, and this is a wild guess that I'm making, but two of the important witnesses to the shorter stream, 621 in particular, but also 463, have a different sort of Catena type. 621 it really isn't alternating, or it's certainly not frame, but you have the continuous text of Jude followed by continuous Catena text. So that might explain it. 463 is also similar in that it doesn't have Jude text. Only in two places where it actually abridges the Jude text with heos, an abbreviated heos. It also, that's in the footnote, has a very interesting textual variant in the Jude text that is extant, but you can read that there. But so I wonder if these two, and 621 clearly being a very important witness to the stream, if it wasn't this sort of feature of what the scribes were doing in writing it after the text, and since the Catholic epistles come in most of these manuscripts right before Romans, or before more bigger works, and in some cases right near the end of the manuscript, one wonders if they weren't abridged for space saving. Or in some cases you have frame Catena manuscripts whose margins look a little, so I did not measure them, didn't take out my ruler on the screen, but who look a little small, especially 1162, it is highly abridged, like 621. One wonders if perhaps in a frame Catena with small margins, this wouldn't have been a space-saving device.
And the scribal pans are equally professional in the longer screen and shorter screen?
No, they vary. They vary by from manuscript to manuscript and century to century. We love, of course, the 13th century manuscripts. Those are my favorite.
Well, thank you very much. As we are running out of time, please join me thanking our speaker again.